Back in Los Angeles, police detective Sergeant Dan Stewart was ordered to get to Good Samaritan and help take charge of security. For the next 12 hours, he and his colleagues had problems with the Kennedys and their aides. They didn't appreciate any of the police, he said. They were pushy, and at one point one of the cops knocked Jesse Unruh on his ass, just leveled him. They were trying to tell us how to run the show, and we just said, we don't care what you guys did in Dallas. Let's not have it here. They finally eased up because they got a bar set up on a medical trolley in one of the waiting rooms, and they started drinking. The booze was brought in through a back entrance by one of their people. They were abusive folks. At one point, Stewart was sitting next to one of the doctors handling Bobby's case. I asked, how's he doing? And the doctor looked at me and said, he's dead. I said, dead? And then he took me to the room and pointed to a screen beside the bed and said, look at this. We've got a straight line. He said, we're just pumping charges into the brain just to keep him going. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and today we're going to keep going in the other Mrs. Kennedy. We are going to finish the presidential candidate's wife today. So I don't have a long intro. We know where we're at in the book right now, but I just want to go ahead and get started reading because I want to finish this part today. This first chapter we're going to read is entitled The Jackie Problem. And of course, you'll remember that when he was running for senator, Jackie really was disengaged. Well, she's not planning on showing up now, but there's greater problems to deal with because she has met Aristotle Onassis and the family hates him. So let's see what they're going to do about that. Ethel seemed to show little concern about her children's behavior, writing it off as youthful Kennedy exuberance. She was more bothered about Jackie's behavior and the impact it would have on Bobby's campaign. At the time Bobby announced his candidacy, Jackie, widowed for less than 5 years, had started seeing Aristotle Onassis, one of the world's wealthiest men. While Onassis was usually discreet, he had gossiped about Jackie at a cocktail party in Paris a few days after Bobby hit the campaign trail, and the conversation had reached Bobby's ears. Onassis had expressed the view that Jackie, quote, is a totally misunderstood woman. She needs a small scandal to bring her alive, peccadillo and indiscretion. When Bobby heard the comment, he was furious. Jackie was a Kennedy. There would be no scandal, he declared. Moreover, Bobby felt personally wounded by Jackie's relationship with a man he found despicable. When Bobby announced his run, Jackie was in Mexico and released a statement saying, I will always be with him with all my heart. I shall always back him. While Jackie was conscious of, and sensitive to, Bobby's concerns about Onassis, she was also determined to live her own life and not be dominated by the Kennedys. Disapproving of her new relationship, Ethel and Bobby had sarcastically started calling Onassis that Greek. They watched with concern, along with other members of the clan, as Jackie visited Onassis's secluded island, his apartment in Paris, and went nightclub hopping with him in New York, where he spent time at her duplex in Fifth Avenue. At one point, Ethel paid a visit to Jackie and pleaded with her not to marry Onassis, saying that it would hurt Bobby's campaign and injure the family name. But Ethel, who never felt any real connection to Jackie, and the feeling was mutual, left without any concessions. Next, Bobby met with Jackie. When she told him that marriage to Onassis was a strong possibility, he was outraged. Afraid to alienate her, Bobby controlled his anger. Jackie's allegiance was too important to him and his career, so he jokingly said that such a union, quote, could cost me 5 states. Sympathetic to his situation, Jackie agreed to put off any announcement until after the November election. She told Onassis of her conversation, but he was dubious about the arrangement. Bobby, he said, is making it too effing easy. He just sees me as the rich prick moving in on his brother's widowed woman. Sooner or later, it will come to a test of wills. And I just want to make a really little side note here. Notice that this book says that he told her in a annoyed but sarcastic, but I don't want to, get in your face about it, that it was going to cost him 5 states, which is completely different characterization than what we read in Ask Not, which I don't think any of us looked at Ask Not and thought that that was a tale told without any editorialization. But she definitely made it seem like Bobby and Jackie were in each other's face, not coming to blows or anything, but like really letting each other have it when Bobby said that. And yet this book says that he said it jokingly, that could cost me 5 states. I mean, it's not a big deal or anything like that. I think that while Ask Not was a really tantalizing read, though nothing compared to this, and this feels like it's facts, that book just continually shows to me that the agenda of that author crippled the telling of the tale. And I don't think that Bobby was, screaming at Jackie, "That's going to cost me 5 states," Anyway, let's keep going. In the end, none of the Kennedys could stop Jackie. On October 20th, 1968, on Scorpios, 34 days before the 5th anniversary of Jack's death, the 39-year-old widow married the 62-year-old billionaire. Ethel would always remain bitter about Jackie's decision. Some years later, when Ethel heard that Onassis had died, she told a servant, "Maybe I can get out of the funeral. I'll call Ted and see if I can get him to represent the Kennedys." Poor Ted. He's just everybody's errand boy. And that's why they love him so, because he knows that he's got nothing to offer, and so he's just got to scuttle around and do what they say. In the weeks before Dallas, Look magazine had been working on a feature about Jack and John John, a cover story entitled "The President and His Son." When Jack was killed, the issue had already gone to press and couldn't be stopped. The upbeat piece, with a picture of the little boy in shorts smiling at his proudly beaming presidential dad, took up the whole cover, appearing on newsstands a few days after the assassination. It caused a lot of talk and embarrassed Look. Now, almost 5 years later, Look had another cover piece in the works, this one on Ethel, whom editors at the magazine now viewed as the next First Lady of the land. When Bobby decided to run in mid-March, Look editors had quickly assigned the story to be headlined "Ethel's Kennedys, How She Manages Them," to its crack pictorial reportage team of Laura Berquist and Stanley Tredick. They scheduled the Ethel cover for June 25, 1968, which would hit the stands a week after the June primary in California. Later, the ironic timing of those two covers would become eerily apparent. Tredick had started photographing Bobby for the United Press International as early as his Senate Racket Committee days, and more recently had shot Bobby's Senate campaign, and the two had become good friends. Along the way, Tredick and Berquist had been invited to Kennedy functions and dinners, becoming a part of the elite circle of journalists at Hickory Hill. By the time the Look editors came up with the idea for a cover on Ethel, Tredick and Berquist had what everyone in the news business could only dream of: complete access to the Kennedys. If Bobby was elected president, he'd promised Tredick the job of official White House photographer. For the Look story, Ethel had decided that it would be easier if Stan and Laura spent time at Hickory Hill and watched the family in action. Berquist could freely take notes, and Tredick could shoot candid pictures. Kennedy insiders already were touting the article as, quote, "the best thing ever done on Ethel," who Look said remains probably the least known Kennedy. When the story appeared a week after Bobby's death, Ethel was portrayed as a happy, busy, concerned mother, bathing and feeding her children and asking questions about their schoolwork. No mention was made of the problems she was having with the adolescents. Those stories wouldn't become public for years, when the young Kennedys began to speak out candidly. All in all, the Look story read as though it had been blue-penciled by Ethel herself, perpetuating all the old images and myths. Berquist painted Ethel as ebullient, gregarious, terribly friendly, vulnerable, a funny combination of very mod and old-fashioned, shrewd and naive, puritanical and open-minded, ferociously candid. Above all, she shies from self-revelation, which perhaps accounts for the astounding Ethel gap in the Kennedy literature. Look, I know it's fun to place adjectives against each other, but how exactly is one puritanical and open-minded, old-fashioned and mod, shrewd and naive? I mean, I'm not saying one couldn't be those things, but how do we know she's all those things when we don't even know anything about Ethel, as the article went on to say? Particularly, how is one shrewd and naive, I ask you? Anyway, years later, Tredick talked about the Ethel cover story assignment and the view he and Berquist had of her at the time. "I never bought that she was a great mother. The operation at Hickory Hill was too loose. The kids all went their separate ways. It was like bedlam, everyone running around crazy. When Bobby was around, the kids were much calmer. I don't think that he would take any shit from them. He was like a father and a mother, good with the kids, very loving with them. And when he said do something, they did it. One night about 10 o'clock, Ethel was going to fix food for us, but she said, 'I don't know how to fix shit.' She couldn't handle anything in the kitchen. Pots and pans were all over the place. Bobby looked at her and said, 'Mother of the Year.' I was never around when Laura interviewed Ethel, but I was there shooting sometimes when Laura was watching the kids. Insane's the word for it. Laura's comment was, 'Why am I subjected to this?' I remember their view of Ethel was, 'It's going to be bedlam, just nuts if she goes to the White House, because that place will become a real zoo. Crazy, nuts.' Ethel's first lady would have been pretty high-handed, too. She's a very demanding woman. I'm the queen. My general feeling was that Laura had found Ethel difficult. I don't think she was very fond of her. We all knew Ethel was difficult. Any story you ever did on the Kennedys with Ethel involved was pandemonium. It's unbelievable what you'd have to go through. Like so many others, Treddick was eventually dropped from Ethel's A-list. In his case, she had hated a photo he'd taken of Bobby on the broad shoulders of his pal Rosie Greer, wearing Greer's thick glasses. According to Treddick, Ethel had Frank Mankiewicz disinvite him from a special memorial service for her husband. I said to myself, well, that's Ethel. She's displeased with something, so she made her feelings known. I had heard that she could be vindictive. It was very hurtful to me. It was never the same for me after that. I'd see her from time to time, and she'd say hello and smile, but that was it. What is wrong with this person? Why in the world would you get mad about your husband being on the shoulders of Rosie Greer and, wearing the glasses? Ethel's over there pushing people into pools, it's all the madcap, I Love Lucy stuff. And then when her husband gets on the shoulders of this, isn't Rosie Greer a football player? When he gets on the shoulders of this, big athlete, what she is embarrassed by it? She thinks it's not dignified? I don't know. Ethel, are you really want to point fingers? This next chapter is entitled Winning and Losing. The Indiana campaign had been difficult, but in the end, Bobby had blitzed the state and won the primary with 42% of the vote, despite Ethel's earlier concern. That same day, Bobby also won the District of Columbia, beating Hubert Humphrey. Ethel was thrilled that the blacks and the white blue-collar workers had come out for Bobby. "Don't you just wish that everyone was black?" she crowed. Later, during a party at Hickory Hill for more than 500 wives of newspaper editors, Ethel approached Flaxie Pinkett, a black real estate woman and a D.C. civic leader who was supporting Bobby's campaign, and she asked her to recite the pro-Kennedy speech she'd been giving. Ethel liked Flaxie's words so much that she used similar material in her own speeches. "Ethel," said a friend who witnessed the scene, "seems to have discovered the Negro." Well, most politicians eventually get around to it. This idea that people of different skin colors can somehow help you and that you should just block everybody together in one group. And then if one person that of a certain skin color thinks a thing, then probably the other people could be convinced of it as well. And all you have to do is just play these people. I found it so distasteful. And Ethel's just, "Don't you wish everyone is black?" And running over to the one black person she knows to, "What is your pro-Kennedy speech?" Yeah, I think her friend's sarcasm is well placed. It's very annoying. But she was a politician's wife, so I suppose it's in the water. On her return from Indiana, word had finally leaked out that Ethel was pregnant with number 11. Maxine Cheshire reported on May 9th that, quote, "close friends are saying she's expecting sometime near the date of the inauguration," as if it were a given that Bobby would be the one sworn in. Ethel refused to confirm or deny the pregnancy story. "I never answer that question, and I'm not going to answer it now," she firmly told a reporter. But Bobby, in Hyannis for a quick visit with his father at the Kennedy compound, confirmed but declined to elaborate. "Further information will have to come from Mrs. Kennedy," he said. Kennedy's office in New York later disclosed the baby was due in January. During the campaign, Bobby had tickled the crowds and caused Ethel to beam when he engaged in a mock exchange with what he termed, "all you Planned Parenthood people back there in the back row with your placards." His comments were aimed at William Vogt, a former director of the Planned Parenthood Federation, who proclaimed that a man with 10 children had the wrong image to be president. He charged that the election of Kennedy, quote, would set back for years the attempts to achieve a rational population policy. How does one achieve a rational population policy? Maybe we could ask China about that. Planned Parenthood revolted Ethel as much as abortion did, and she found Fox's disapproval just plain silly. "I wish their parents had limited their children," she spat back. Later, when Ethel was asked by a reporter if she thought big families were truly advisable on the overpopulated planet, she said, "But what would we do without Teddy? He would never have been born," she pointed out, "if Rose had stopped at 8. Well, I don't know if that's your strongest argument, but... After Indiana, Bobby took her campaign by car and train through rural Nebraska, which he won by May 14th, with 51.5% of the vote. McCarthy had surprisingly given up the state altogether and moved on to Oregon and California. In Colorado, Ethel pulled off one of her elaborate pranks, arranging for a mock political rally, complete with signs, cheers, and music for Fred Dutton. Remember, Fred Dutton is one of his big campaign advisors. When the 6-car campaign train arrived in Dutton's birthplace of Julesburg, Ethel and some of the girls on the press staff had made up the signs and Dutton's buttons and painted poster slogans on shopping bags. "Beautify America. Get a haircut, Fred," read one sign. "Fred Dutton's brother for Attorney General," read another. "Make Fred, not war," proclaimed a third. Bobby got on the rear platform of the train and placed a placard that read, "Sock it to him, Freddie," and led a chant, "We want Fred!" Ethel insisted that Dutton give a speech using many of Bobby's phrases, his accent, and mannerisms. She still wouldn't let him go. "Hey, how about George Bernard Shaw?" she shouted. Dutton was forced to give the quotation from the Irish writer that was the signal in Bobby's standard speech for a reporter to scramble back on the train. Ethel went home for a few days, then flew to Portland with Gerald Tremblay, who was helping Bobby in the Oregon primary. We took off from National Airport, and she squeezed my hand the whole way. I thought her fingernails were going to go through my skin, he recalled. She had her prayer beads, and she was saying the rosary. She had a lot of fear going out there. In Oregon, the Kennedy juggernaut met with disaster. Oregonians weren't Bobby's constituency. The state had few blacks, Catholics, or poor people. But there were lots of hunters who were against gun control, something Bobby felt strongly about since Dallas. McCarthy wanted a television debate, and Bobby refused, which didn't help the Kennedy cause either. On May 28th, when the ballots had been counted, Bobby became the first Kennedy ever to lose an election. McCarthy had won 44.7% on Bobby's 38.8%. Ethel couldn't understand the defeat. "Such a small state," she said several times. "Do you really think that it would make that much of a difference if we win in California? That's the important state, more like the rest of the country." All right, this chapter is entitled California Sunshine. On Wednesday, May 29th, the morning after losing the Oregon primary, Bobby Kennedy landed in Los Angeles to begin the grueling week of campaigning that would lead up to Tuesday, June 4th, California's primary, his most important yet. Bobby saw the loss in California as a setback, but the multitude of Californians who turned out for his speech and motorcades restored his confidence. It was in Los Angeles that it got his biggest welcome as thousands of blacks, Latinos, and Oriental Americans lined the streets, a ton of confetti swirling around them. "Piss on Oregon," some shouted, as a smiling Bobby passed. At Hickory Hill, meanwhile, Bob Gallen, poor guy, received his latest marching orders from Ethel via Pierre Salinger's wife, Nicole. "Ethel wants 6 of the kids to campaign. Get yourself a new suit, pick up traveler's checks, and show up in Los Angeles," he was told. His charges included David, Michael, Carrie, Courtney, Christopher, and Max. The next day, they flew out on American Airlines from Dulles and were met by Ethel at LAX, taken to Beverly Hills Hotel, and installed in a 3-bedroom bungalow. They were excited to see their parents, Gallen recalled, excited to be campaigning. On Saturday, June 1st, Bobby and Gene McCarthy, who had been slightly behind in the polls but gaining fast, finally had a much-heralded debate in San Francisco. Bobby had agreed to the nationally televised face-off, charging that the Minnesotans' great crusade that began for the future of the United States is now involved in a campaign to distort and stop me. His statement was in response to a full-page anti-Kennedy advertisement that McCarthy had placed in the Los Angeles Times on May 30th. While the press had hyped the debate to a point where some viewers expected fisticuffs, it was, in the end, bland and unenlightening. At the conclusion, each candidate was asked to state his qualifications, and Bobby's response seemed unfocused. Asked why later, he said, "Well, you won't believe it, but I was daydreaming. I thought the program was over, and I was trying to decide in my mind where to take Ethel for dinner." How good of him, but really? I mean, he wasn't off the stage yet, so how's the program over? You know what I'm saying? Anyway, okay. On the flight back to Los Angeles, journalist Jack Newfield stopped to talk to Bobby. For the first time, he saw what the last few weeks had done to him. His face looked like an old man's. There were lines. I'd never noticed that before. The eyes were puffy and red and pushed back into his sockets. His hands shook, as they often did when he was speaking in public. He was so tired. The next day, Sunday, June 2nd, Bobby combined campaigning with some amusement. We had a motorcade in Orange County, all fun and games, and then we wound up at Disneyland, where we got a VIP tour for half a day, recalled Bob Galland. The kids were constantly badgered by the press, cameras in their faces and microphones in their faces. The photographers would be walking backward taking pictures, and the kids would run ahead and get on their hands and knees so the guy walking backward would stumble and fall over them. Ethel got a kick out of that. She would. Ethel. I feel like for my own sake, I just couldn't live in a zoo like that. Like, even if I didn't think it was like that big of a deal if the kids stripped the photographers, which I would think that that's a big deal. I don't want my kids being disrespectful to people, but even if I didn't think it was that big of a deal, I just don't want to be encircled by a zoo. I just couldn't. I mean, I feel like my nerves couldn't take it. On the eve of the primary, Monday, June 3rd, an exhausted Bobby and Ethel traveled more than 1,000 miles, from Los Angeles to San Francisco and then back to Long Beach and San Diego. During a rally in San Francisco's Chinatown, a cherry bomb exploded close to Bobby and Ethel's convertible. Then a string of firecrackers went off. Visions of Dallas. Ethel ducked, terrified, trembling, and pale. The press corps tensed, wondering whether bullets had been fired. But Bobby remained standing, motioning to a friend to hold Ethel's hand and help calm her. That's one thing I'll say for him. He was no coward. He was well aware, obviously, of what had happened to his brother. But he continued to put himself in situations where he just wasn't going to be bowled over or frightened by that. And I have to give him massive credit for it. I don't know who I would be if one of my siblings had been gunned down and then I was basically in the same position that they had been. I feel like I would be very fearful, expecting the worst at every turn. And while I don't want to diminish his courage at all, you do also have to ask yourself, was it vibrato? Was it pride? Was it hubris? Or was it truly just courage that I think that this is what I've been destined to do and I'm going to meet my destiny? I don't know. But anyway, he definitely didn't shy away from things. By the time they reached Long Beach, Bobby was physically depleted. Like a hypoglemic, he slurred his words and felt shaky. I don't feel so good, he admitted to Fred Dutton. As the motorcade went through Venice, Bobby complained of an upset stomach and asked for ginger ale. In San Diego, he had to be helped to a dressing room at the El Cortez Hotel after getting dizzy and nauseous. Rosie Greer and Raffer Johnson waited while he vomited. A few minutes later, he returned to finish his speech, looking sickly. Bobby's previous campaign trips normally ended lightheartedly, but not this one. The subdued group boarded a plane for Los Angeles, Bobby sitting alone looking ill with Ethel. He finally asked the singer Rosemary Clooney to join them. That night, the candidate, his wife, and the 6 children moved into director John Frankenheimer's Malibu beach house to relax, the first time most of the family had been together in weeks. Primary day, Tuesday, June 5th, was smoggy and overcast, typical for Los Angeles. At the Frankenheimers, the Kennedys slept late while the kids romped on the beach. After brunch, Bobby walked down to the water with the writer Theodore White to gaze at the big white-capped waves. Spotting Bob Galland watching the children, he said, "Why don't you take the day off? Don't worry about the kids today." Music to my ears if I was Bob Galland. Galland wandered back toward the house, but from the window he could see Bobby and David talking together and then watch them wade into the pounding surf. The water was freezing, and it was rough, and the wind was blowing, and it was overcast, Galland recalled. It was not a day for swimming. Suddenly, tensing, Galland saw a big wave crash, sucking both David and Bobby under. I could see them getting rolled around, and then I saw Bobby come up, holding David. Everybody ran down to the water's edge. Ethel touched the bruise. A strawberry burn was the way Galland described it later. Bobby now had over his right eyebrow, caused by the rough sand when it went under. "Everything's fine," Bobby said, calming the others, patting the stinging bruise. "The surf's just got too rough." They all walked back to the house to swim and lounge by the pool. Bobby tussled with the children. "Mummy's so tired, she's going to rest the next week, and I'm going to take care of you myself. How do you like that?" They loved the idea, but they didn't believe him. Even they knew the campaign took priority. Around 3 in the afternoon, Ethel suggested to Galland that he take the children back to the hotel so they could rest. She wanted the kids to come back to the Ambassador Hotel that evening to partake in the election returns, he said. By 6:30, Bobby was dressed and ready to leave, but Ethel wasn't. It was decided that Bobby would drive into town with Frankenheimer and Dutton, and that Ethel would follow. 30 minutes later, with the polls closing in an hour, Bobby got off the elevator at the 5th floor and stepped into room 516, the royal suite, already filled with family members. Teddy, Jean, and Pat, advisors Richard Goodwin and Ted Sorensen, and the inner circle of journalists, Jimmy Breslin, Stan Tredick, Pete Hamill, and others, all drinking and watching television. Not long after he arrived, Bobby learned that he'd won another primary that day in South Dakota, about 50% of the vote. The Indians, he boasted, they were behind him. By the time the California polls closed at 8, the embassy ballroom downstairs was already jammed with supporters, campaign workers, and reporters. Upstairs, a party atmosphere reigned. At the Beverly Hills Hotel, Bob Galland noticed how tired the children were from their day at the beach. He telephoned Nicole Salinger and suggested that the 2 younger ones, Max and Christopher, remain at the bungalow under the care of an assistant, Diane Broughton, and he'd bring Carrie, Michael, Courtney, and David to campaign headquarters. Salinger gave her approval, and Galland and the brood left by limousine, arriving at the Ambassador not long after Ethel. Early projections by the network showed Bobby winning California. He was in a jubilant mood. Still ahead, he knew, was the New York primary on June 18th, and then a 10-day trip to Europe, followed by a cross-country campaign in all the non-primary states. But winning California was crucial. In the crowded suite, Bobby lit up a celebratory cigar and mixed with the reporters, giving interviews to his network friends, including NBC's Sandra Vanacore and CBS's Roger Mudd. By 10:30, as Bobby talked to the press, Galland noticed that the children were exhausted. He suggested to Ethel that he take them back to the bungalow, and that they watch the remainder of the festivities on television. She agreed, kissing each goodbye. Back at the hotel, they played with a little monkey that had been given to Carrie by someone earlier that day at the Frankenheimers. How unusual. Finally, Galland put Carrie, Michael, and Courtney to bed. The two younger ones, Max and Christopher, were already asleep, as was Diane Broughton in the other bungalow. Gallon took off his suit and shoes and settled in front of the TV set. Across the room, David, playing with the monkey, casually watched the TV. By 11:30, Bobby knew he had won. He had a private meeting with an aide and then went into the bedroom to get Ethel, who was stretched out on the bed. "Are you ready?" he asked. She jumped to her feet, smoothed her orange and white mini dress, and got into her heels. "Do you think we should take Freckles down?" Bobby asked her. Some weeks earlier, McCarthy had said that Bobby would require a dog and an astronaut to win. Ethel laughed. Someone joked that the vote showed that not everybody disliked her husband. Ethel took a playful poke at the speaker. The Kennedys left the suite. Chapter 87. The light is snuffed out. On his way down the hall, Bobby said that it had all been worth it. "I like politics," he said. "It's an honorable adventure." They got on the service elevator and rode to the second floor, with former FBI agent Bill Barry, Bobby's bodyguard, on their side. Only moments before, Barry had mentioned that he sometimes got mixed up in big crowds. "Maybe I won't be able to react quickly enough," he said. But Bobby had declined police protection, and Barry had full responsibility for the candidate's safety. Rosie Greer and Raffer Johnson also helped with the crowds. Bobby had ruled out any form of police security because he felt it placed a barrier between him and the public. He was not going to be isolated. He was not going to be sealed off, Fred Dutton remarked later. A reporter who was covering the campaign, John Lindsay, felt that Barry had, quote, an impossible duty, because it was not possible to protect Bobby from danger. Only 2 weeks earlier, Pierre Salinger had been warned by a friend that Bobby would be killed. And Salinger agreed that he knew Bobby was in danger, but that it was impossible to run for president and not be surrounded by people all the time. Since arriving in Los Angeles, Bobby had made it clear that he didn't like having police around him, said a former Los Angeles police sergeant, Marion Hoover, who had initially been assigned to the candidate's detail. Hoover claimed that during one campaign stop, Bobby had actually slapped the hand of an officer who had tried to assist him when he was engulfed by supporters and knocked to the ground. On another occasion, a pickpocket grabbed Bobby's watch and tried to escape through the crowd. Hoover spotted the man and ordered him arrested. With that, Kennedy blew up, Hoover recalled. "He came apart and he began to scream at me. 'Get the hell away from me and stay away.' And I remember thinking, I'm not taking this treatment from anybody. I couldn't believe that a presidential aspirant, especially a Kennedy, would make such a decision." Later, Los Angeles Police Chief Thomas Redden declared that all efforts to protect Bobby had been flatly refused. "I got the impression that he wished to appear to be anti-police and anti-establishment, and not to need our help because politically it was the smart thing to do at the time." But common sense-wise, is it the smart thing to do? Your brother was literally gunned down in the street. And as much as you want to seem anti-establishment, unfortunately the establishment is what protects one. Because getting a couple of your friends, former football players and whatnot, isn't really the same as getting trained help. And it is shocking to me that he would have chosen to go into areas that are so tightly congested without any kind of security detail having made sure that the place was safe to go into. Bill Barry, he had one bodyguard. Bill Barry is supposed to be enough. And I go back to my question of, was it bravery or was it hubris? On the one hand, I think that he was a brave person because consistently in his life he showed that he would go into situations and scenarios that a lesser man might not have approached. But then sometimes his behavior is tinged with this question of, are you showing off? No, it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world to accept help from the police, to at least get you through the streets safely, so that you aren't being grabbed by 1,000 people. And it is, it's a pretty image that there's no distance between you and the rest of the world, that you're just like one of them. But the thing is, you aren't just like one of them. You aren't just one of them because you're running for president, you're a Kennedy. And you can keep pretending and playing facades and pretending like you're just this other man who's just going in the street. I'm just like one of you. You're not one of them. You're not a blue-collar worker. You aren't a member of the African American community who has struggled against Jim Crow and is trying to find their way out of an oppressive community. You aren't the poor and downtrodden. And to play act as though he was and to refuse to accept help from the police, to basically be like, yeah, I think they're pigs too, just to get some votes, may in the end have cost him his life. The embassy ballroom was pandemonium when Bobby, flanked by Ethel and Steve Smith, stepped onto the small speakers platform before a bouquet of microphones. Ethel waved to the crowd, and then Bobby spoke. He thanked everyone for the win, from Cesar Chavez. who had helped bring up the Mexican-American vote, to the Dodgers' Dan Drysdale, who had pitched his 6th straight shutout that night. "I hope that we have as much good fortune in our campaign," Bobby said to Ethel, whose patience during the whole effort was fantastic. He said, "My thanks to all of you, and on to Chicago, and let's win there." Flashing the V for Victory sign, Bobby waded into the crowd on his way to give a press conference in a room on the other side of the hotel's kitchen. Bill Barry stopped for a moment to help Ethel down from the podium, and in that split second the candidate and his bodyguard, the candidate and his wife, were separated. Back at the Beverly Hills Hotel, David Kennedy watched on TV as his father disappeared into the crowd. "The speech was over and I got up and I started switching the channel," said Bob Galland, "and then I saw that something had obviously happened." As he stepped down off the podium, the assistant maitre d' at the ambassador took Bobby's right hand and began leading him through a pantry area toward the colonial room where the print media was waiting. On the way, Bobby turned to look for Ethel and stopped to talk with the kitchen help, shaking hands with a 17-year-old busboy, Juan Romero. Seconds later, a small, swarthy 24-year-old man named Saran Bishara Saran, dressed in blue and wearing a smile, stepped off a tray rack shouting, "Kennedy, you son of a bitch," and shoved a .22 caliber Ivor Johnson cadet revolver an inch from the senator's ear and pulled the trigger, emptying the chamber of its 8 bullets. Bobby Kennedy threw his hands up toward his face, staggered back, and crumpled to the gray concrete, mortally wounded. "Ethel was sort of with us because she knew us," recalled Roger Mudd later, "and we heard those shots, and it was like Hades, this screaming that was going on. It was absolutely unworldly. It was just awful. You weren't prepared for it. The ring of people around Bobby's body got heavier and thicker, and there was screaming and the guys just slamming at each other trying to wrestle Saran to the ground. Jim Wilson, one of the TV cameramen, was absolutely going out of his mind. He was so frustrated, so frozen. Ethel just grabbed onto my arm. She was just shaking, and I sort of shouldered my way through, just sort of forcing, and pulling her with me and yelling, 'Let Ethel through! Let Mrs. Kennedy through!' And finally the crowd opened up enough for her to go through, and she went through." In the living room of the Kennedy Children's Bungalow, a horrified Bob Galland stayed frozen on the camera shot of Bobby on the ground in the eerie glow of a TV light for 5 or 10 seconds too long, as 12-year-old David, still dressed in his blue blazer and gray slacks and playing with the little monkey, watched. There was no doubt that the senator had been shot. David saw it. There was definite shock there, recalled Galland. "I left the TV on 5, 7, 10 seconds too long, and I'm standing there flipping around to catch other coverage and then just turn the damn thing off. I sat down with David and for an awkward few moments wondered what the hell I'm going to say to this kid. But I got to do something. So I gave him a hug and I said, 'David, let's just go for a walk for a while. Wait and see what happens. Other news reports will come in.' He said something like, 'Oh man, it's over. They got him too.' He was not surprised his father was shot. I said to David, 'Let's get out of here.' I knocked on the door, and I woke up Diane Broughton, and I told her that the senator had been shot, and she fell apart, literally, wrapped up in a blanket and started crying. I said, 'Knock it off. You got a job to do.' So she pulled herself together and walked me outside. I told her, 'Don't let anyone in the bungalow unless they're with me.' She said, 'Anyone?' My major concern, and it was definitely concern, was I didn't want anyone coming in and waking up the kids and telling them that their father's been shot. Then David and I went for a walk." This is a really interesting point right here, and I really appreciate that Oppenheimer put this in here. He said, "For years afterward, it was reported erroneously in many books and magazine articles that David had watched the assassination alone in a suite at the Ambassador Hotel. The story had originated from an article written by Dr. Gerald Kaplan, a psychiatrist, in the September 1968 issue of McCall's. In the piece headlined Lessons in Bravery, which was picked up by the news media, the doctor attributed his information about David to campaign chronicler Theodore White. But White had made no mention of the incident in his book in the 1968 race. Galland said that White, who died in 1986, had looked in on David an hour or two after Galland had arranged for David to be put in another room at the Beverly Hills Hotel. He probably found him there alone for a moment, and the facts got mixed up about the time and location from that point on, Galland theorized. Back at the hotel, Juan Ramiro, the kitchen worker, who had shaken hands with Bobby moments later before the shooting, was now bending over the fallen candidate, putting a rosary on his hand. Bobby clutched the beads. His lips moved, but nobody could hear what he was saying. Ethel, her eyes wild with fear, was kneeling in her husband's blood. "Get back, all of you!" she screamed. "Get out! Get out! Give him room to breathe!" A cameraman yelled back, "This is history, lady!" Can you even imagine? She's kneeling in her husband's blood, and the cameraman's like, "I gotta get my shot, lady." Honestly, the way Ethel is treated in this scenario is so unbelievable. I know Ethel might have had her problems, but her husband was just shot. Can we show a little grace and kindness to the poor woman? Bobby turned his head and seemed to recognize Ethel as she whispered to him, stroked him. His sister Jean, who first brought Ethel and Bobby together many years earlier, knelt beside her. Newsman Charles Quinn saw Ethel leaning over Bobby, whose shirt was open. Quinn noted that Bobby was still alive because he saw him fingering the rosary beads which were lying across his belt. Ethel looked up at me at one point and said, "Oh, Chuck, please go away." But I couldn't leave. You couldn't leave? Can the woman please have a moment with her dying husband? This is the end. I mean, he's going to live for a few more days, but it's inevitable. Death is inevitable. So I don't know why this Chuck's over there looming. Let the poor woman have a moment. Several others had been shot along with Bobby. One, Ira Goldstein, a 19-year-old reporter for Continental News Service, had staggered to a chair wounded in the left thigh and asked, "How is Senator Kennedy? What happened to him?" Ethel, disoriented, in shock, heard him. She said to me, "How dare you talk about my husband that way?" And she slapped me across the face. And I said, "I'm sorry, lady, but I was shot. I'd like to know how the senator is, too." And she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, honey," and kissed me. At that time, she was not in tears. She was a little hysterical, though, but she wasn't crying. Less than a dozen feet away, Bill Barry, Rosie Greer, and Raffer Johnson still struggled with Saran for the gun, pinning the tiny assassin on a steam table. There were shouts of, "Kill him! Get the gun, Raffer! Get away from the barrel, you monster! You'll die for this!" A Christian Arab who had emigrated from Jerusalem in 1957 at age 12, Saran apparently held Kennedy responsible for his people's problems. "I did it for my country," he screamed later on his way to jail. In the ballroom, Steve Smith pleaded for a doctor over the public address system. The word spread. "Bobby's been shot." Kennedy girls in white blouses and navy blue skirts and straw skimmer hats burst into tears. At 12:23 a.m., 2 ambulance attendants, Max Behrman and Robert Hulsman, arrived with a rolling stretcher. Bobby whispered, "Don't lift me, don't lift me." The only words Baran recalled him saying. "Gently," Ethel implored, "gently," as they lifted Bobby onto the gurney and strapped him down. Before losing consciousness, Bobby, in terrible pain, said, "Oh, no, no, don't." They were the last words he would ever utter in public. With Ethel, his sister Jean, Dutton, Barry, and a few others in close attendance, Bobby was wheeled to an elevator where Berman began to bark orders, infuriating Ethel, who shouted at him to be quiet. An argument ensued, and one of the women in the entourage slapped the medic, who threatened to crush her head if she did that again. And at one point, the men were moving the stretcher so fast it almost ran out of control. At the ambulance, Behrman declared that only Ethel could ride with Bobby. Ethel wanted Father James Mundell, a lay priest and friend of the Kennedys, to ride with her and Bobby, but he got lost in the crowd. Dutton pushed Behrman aside and squeezed in next to Ethel. Barry and Lux Warren Rogers hopped into the front seat. The ambulance, lights and siren blazing, sped towards Central Receiving Hospital a mile away. Seeing that Bobby was having trouble breathing, the medic tried to slap an oxygen mask on his face and head, where the bullet wound was. Ethel screamed at him and wouldn't let him touch Bobby. "I tried to check his wounds, but she told me to keep my hands off," Behrman said. "I tried to put bandages on him, but she wouldn't let me. She got so mad at me, she threw my logbook out the window." Suddenly, Bobby's breathing turned heavy, and Ethel let Behrman clap an oxygen mask over his nose and mouth. "Is he breathing?" Ethel cried. Behrman said he was. The ambulance attendant wheeled the litter into emergency room number 2 at Central Receiving and lifted Bobby onto a padded aluminum table. As Ethel watched, nurses cut off his clothes to prepare him for a heart-lung resuscitator. His eyes were fixed and staring. He was nearly pulseless, his blood pressure close to 0. The doctor thought he was dead at first glance. "The bullet hit the switchboard," he said. He slapped Bobby several times in the face, saying, "Bob! Bob! Bob!" The doctor then determined there was a heartbeat. He took the stethoscope and put it to Ethel's ear so she'd know that he was still alive. She listened like a mother hearing a baby's first heartbeat, and she was overjoyed, he said later. "Will he live?" she begged. The doctor told her that for now, Bobby would be all right. Outside the emergency room, meanwhile, Father Mundell was being blocked from entering by a policeman. Seeing them arguing, Ethel ran out and pushed the officer, yelling that she wanted the priest with her. The policeman shoved her in the chest. Maybe this is why Bobby wasn't too keen on the police. I mean, shoving a woman, what the hell? But then this business about shoving a woman whose husband has been shot in the head with 8 bullets? Ease up, man. Dutton broke up the pushing match, and the priest was allowed to enter the room, where he gave Bobby absolution. At that moment, another priest, Father Thomas Picha, entered the room and performed the last rites of the Catholic Church. 30 minutes later, it was decided to transfer Bobby several blocks away to Good Samaritan Hospital, where he would undergo surgery for the removal of 2 bullets. One had entered the mastoid bone and lodged in the midline of the brain. Another was lodged in the back of the neck. A third had grazed the forehead. At 1 o'clock in the morning, Bobby was brought out on a stretcher with tubes running into his body and wearing an oxygen mask. Ethel walked next to him and rode in the ambulance with him. At Good Samaritan, he was rushed to the 9th floor surgery. Father Mundell had stayed with Ethel and now suggested she lie down, as other family members, Jean and Pat among them, joined her in the vigil. Within minutes of Bobby's arrival at Good Samaritan, Ethel received a telegram from the President and Lady Bird. "We grieve and pray with you." About that time, after having silently walked the quiet streets of Beverly Hills for more than an hour, Bob Galland and David Kennedy ended up behind the pool of the Beverly Hills Hotel drinking Cokes. There were a couple of emotional minutes. There were tears. He brushed a half a dozen of them away, and that was it. He was a Kennedy. He handled it like a big boy, recalled Galland. I was surprised by his maturity, but he was evidently prepared in his own mind for the worst. I could tell it was definitely something he had wrestled with before. I wanted to know what had happened to the senator, but my responsibility was to David. At 21, I was not prepared for this. David was obviously tired, so I left him sitting there and I went into the hotel lobby and told the guy I wanted a room closer to the front desk. I told him who I was, and he gave me a key, and I got David. He obviously wasn't going to go to sleep, and I didn't want him waking the other kids. I stayed with him for a while, got him undressed, put him in bed, and I told him that if I heard any news, I'd be back immediately. Galland walked to the hotel restaurant where he ran into John and Anne Glenn, who wanted to know how the children were. Glenn, remarkably calm, told Galland, "I just want to make sure I can reassure Ethel that the kids are fine." About that time, Galland recalled, Theodore White, who was working on his book, The Making of the President in 1968, also arrived at the hotel. The Glenns, White, and another couple tiptoed into David's room and sat in the dark as the boy slept. As Galland remembers it, "They were all hot to go wake up the kids, and I wouldn't let them do it." At Hickory Hill, Bobby Kennedy Jr. had watched most of the primary night on television, but had gone to bed after hearing that his father had won. He got up the next morning hoping to read about the victory in the paper, but instead saw the headlines about the shooting. He lit a fire in the living room fireplace and fed the newspaper into the flames, page by page. Like so many others on the East Coast, Ethel's pal Sarah Davis had gone to sleep happy with the knowledge that Bobby had won the primary, but unaware of the shooting. Sometime in the middle of the night, the ringing of the telephone awakened her. It was Carmine Bellino, an investigator, who'd worked with Bobby on the Senate Rackets Committee. Bellino, brother-in-law of Bobby's secretary, Angie Novello, told Davis what had happened. Ethel, he said, wanted you to know. He suggested that Davis get to Hickory Hill to help. Davis immediately turned on the television and, with her children, Jock and Tracy, watched a replay of the shooting. "We stayed up the rest of the night and cried," she said later. At Hickory Hill in the morning, she joined other members of the inner circle who were already planning for the inevitable. Back in Los Angeles, police detective Sergeant Dan Stewart was ordered to get to Good Samaritan and help take charge of security. For the next 12 hours, he and his colleagues had problems with the Kennedys and their aides. They didn't appreciate any of the police, he said. They were pushy, and at one point one of the cops knocked Jesse Unruh on his ass, just leveled him. "They were trying to tell us how to run the show, and we just said, we don't care what you guys did in Dallas. Let's not have it here." They finally eased up because they got a bar set up on a medical trolley in one of the waiting rooms, and they started drinking. The booze was brought in through a back entrance by one of their people. They were abusive folks. Steve Smith, for one, was bad news. He said, "I'm a lawyer. I'm this. I'm that." I said, "Just sit down there and have a drink." The family wanted to run the show and tell us how to run our investigation. At one point, Stewart was sitting next to one of the doctors handling Bobby's case. I asked, "How's he doing?" And the doctor looked at me and said, "He's dead." I said, "Dead?" And then he took me to the room and pointed to a screen beside the bed and said, "Look at this. We've got a straight line." He said, "We're just pumping charges into the brain just to keep him going." At 3:12 a.m., a team of 6 surgeons, brain and chest specialists, began a 3-hour and 40-minute last-ditch effort to save Bobby's life in a 9th-floor operating suite, as 2 grim-faced policemen stood guard outside with green surgical smocks over their uniforms. A nurse tried to get Ethel to go back to the 5th floor during the operation, but she refused, sitting instead in a tiny room near surgery, biting her lower lip until the double doors opened and Bobby was wheeled out. In the recovery room, she climbed onto a surgical table and lay there next to him. At 7:20 a.m., Frank Mankiewicz, looking grim, told reporters that all but one fragment of the bullet had been removed from Bobby's brain. The good news was that Bobby was breathing on his own. The bad was that, quote, there may have been impairment of the blood supply to the midbrain, which the doctors explain as governing certain of the vital signs, heart and eye tract level of consciousness, although not directly the thinking process. At a command post established at a nurse's desk, an aide fielded phone calls for the Kennedys from well-meaning people with bizarre suggestions of how to save Bobby's life. Magic words, herbs, onions and garlic, the position of people standing in the room. That morning, one of LBJ's aides visited the hospital. Well, he didn't see either Bobby or Ethel. He sent back word to the president that, quote, things look quite gloomy. There's nothing anyone can do except pray. All the Kennedy people are aware of the president's willingness to do whatever he can. At the Beverly Hills Hotel, the Kennedy children were beginning to stir, and Bob Gallen was a nervous wreck. Colonel Glenn had told me in the middle of the night that he would come up to the bungalow in the morning and help me wake the kids, and that he would tell them what had happened. He never did, and I was really pissed. The kids came wandering in for cereal at different times. As gently as I could, I told them that after their dad's speech the night before, somebody had shot him. What could I say? I told them that he was in the hospital, but their mother was with him. There was crying, but no screaming. Courtney or Carrie or Michael went in and told the little ones. It didn't matter to them. They didn't understand. But it mattered to Michael, to Carrie, and to Courtney. Courtney so much that she was never close to me again for the rest of the time I worked for the Kennedys. She saw me as the one who gave her the bad news. Finally, John Glenn arrived. He had been involved in making arrangements for an Air Force plane to take the young Kennedys back to Washington. Gathering the children around him, he said, everything's going to be all right. Mother's at the hospital. Said Gallen, we got them all dressed, and then we were gone before 10 that morning. Colonel Glenn flew back with us. He would sit with the kids for a while. I'd sit with them for a while. It was an in-flight refueling plane, not a passenger plane, so it was interesting for the children to wander around and explore. There was no talk during the flight about their father. At Good Samaritan, meanwhile, the clan was gathering to plan for the funeral that Ethel and the others now knew was inevitable. The doctors had told Ethel privately that there was little chance for Bobby to pull through. I'll pray, she told them, her voice strong, her face tense. Teddy, who had been Bobby's stand-in at the Kennedy campaign headquarters in San Francisco, became ashen and looked like he was going to faint when told of the shooting. My God, how can this be happening? He groaned. Arrangements were made for an Air Force plane to fly him to Los Angeles so that he could be at his brother's side. Suddenly catapulted by tragedy to the role of acting patriarch, as Bobby had been when Jack was killed, Ted knew his first task was to call Hyannisport to tell his paralyzed father and 77-year-old mother what had happened. But he decided to wait until morning, when more was known about his brother's condition. Rose Kennedy had campaigned for Bobby in California, flying home to watch the primary on TV. Seeing that he was substantially ahead by 11 o'clock, she'd gone to sleep, fairly certain he'd won. She'd gotten up at 6 to go to early Mass at St. Francis Xavier Roman Catholic Church and turned on the TV and heard the news. My mind somehow would not allow me to think that it could be anything really serious, she wrote later in her memoirs. There had been an accident of some sort, perhaps during a victory celebration. I went on dressing, listening distractedly. At that moment, her niece, Anne Garrigan, came in and told her that Bobby had been shot. By the time Teddy had called, his mother knew what had happened. Later, Joe, sitting helplessly in his wheelchair, wept after listening to Ted. It seemed impossible, Rose thought, that the kind of disaster could befall our family twice in 5 years. If I had read anything of the sort in fiction, I would have put it aside as incredible. On the way to Mass, she prayed, Lord have mercy, and thought, oh, Bobby, Bobby, Bobby. Later, she remembered keeping herself busy by sorting and rearranging things in her room. I had to keep moving, I prayed. I still couldn't believe it, although I knew it was so. She also thought of Ethel. Ethel was the most remarkable of all. She and Bobby loved each other deeply. They loved being together, sharing everything. They had a perfect life. Much as I would grieve for Bobby and miss him, I knew she would miss him even more. Not only for all they meant to each other, but as the father of her 10 children, with the 11th to come, posthumously. I knew how difficult it was going to be to raise that big family without the guiding role and influence that Bobby would have provided. And of course she realized that too, fully and keenly. Yet she did not give way. She was calm and courageous, and I was very proud of her. At daybreak after the shooting, the press descended on the compound and police sealed it off. But later in the morning, newsmen witnessed a curious scene. The matriarch, wearing a long pink coat, white shoes, and sunglasses, was seen throwing a tennis ball against the wall of the house that Jack had once lived in. She tossed the ball and catch it, slowly, mechanically. When she realized she was being watched, she said, "Really, how can you be so unfair?" No one answered. Despite her recent dispute with Bobby over her relationship with Onassis, Jackie completely fell apart when she learned of the shooting. Ever since Jack's assassination 5 years earlier, she had lived in fear that the same fate would befall Bobby. Just 2 months earlier, a few weeks after Martin Luther King was gunned down, she had attended a dinner party in New York where she ran into Arthur Schlesinger, and the talk turned to Bobby's campaign. "Do you know what I think will happen to Bobby?" Jackie whispered. "The same thing that happened to Jack. There's too much hatred in this country, and more people hate Bobby than hated Jack. I've told Bobby this, but he isn't fatalistic like me." Jackie in New York had also watched the primary returns on TV and had gone to bed before the shooting. She was awakened by a call from London. Prince Radziwill, husband of her sister Lee, had already heard the news across the ocean. He was horrified when he learned at that moment that he was the bearer of bad tidings. After hanging up, Radziwill grabbed the first flight to New York. Jackie pulled herself together and telephoned a close friend, Roswell Gilpatrick, who had served in the Kennedy administration as Undersecretary of the Air Force. He immediately made arrangements for Jackie to fly to Los Angeles aboard IBM President Thomas Watson's private lease jet. Jackie waited for Radziwill's arrival, and they flew west together. On their arrival at LAX, they were met by Bobby's longtime friend, Chuck Spaulding. "What's the story?" Jackie asked frantically, wearing her trademark sunglasses to cover her eyes, red from crying. "I want it straight from the shoulder." Spaulding gave it to her. "Jackie, he's dying," he said bluntly. Despite their negative feelings about the Kennedys, and Bobby in particular, the Skakel family was horrified and heartbroken. Georgianne called Ethel in Los Angeles. Anne Skakel McCooey Ryan telephoned. Pat Cuff made arrangements to fly in from Ireland. Rushton called. All of them offered her their prayers, but it was mostly the Kennedys and their friends who rallied around Ethel. Even though Jim and Virginia Skakel were living in the Bel Air section of Los Angeles, they did not go to the Victory Night festivities at the Ambassador Hotel. Jim was in Portugal, but he wouldn't have gone had he been home. And Virginia felt funny about showing up since she and Jim rarely talked to Ethel and were not supporters of Bobby's run for the presidency. But Virginia, despite some of her past run-ins with Ethel, was fond of her sister-in-law and thought of her as charismatic, dynamic, and a doer. On primary night, Kennedy family friend Ray O'Connell called. "Ginny, come down to the Ambassador. Ethel wants you to be with us," he had said. And Virginia told him that Jim was away and that she herself couldn't handle all the excitement because she was pregnant. "Well, so's Ethel," O'Connell responded jovially, but Virginia was adamant. The next morning when she heard the horrible news, she rushed to Good Samaritan. "Jim had heard what happened to Bobby and was on his way back," said Virginia years later. "I sat in the hospital all day alone. All the Kennedy family were in Bobby's room with Ethel. They asked me if I wanted to go in, and I said no." Virginia, who had not known previously that Ethel was pregnant, realized the stress she was under and offered her the services of her own obstetrician, Dr. Blake Watson. The doctors whose patients had included Pat Kennedy Lawford had just delivered a baby at St. John's Hospital in Santa Monica when he got a call from Virginia at 6 a.m. The police came and picked me up and took me to Good Samaritan, and the family asked me if I would stay with Ethel. They wanted me to be around as a precaution. I went to see her and to talk to her, and she seemed, naturally, in shock. Meanwhile, a tightly controlled Ethel, a ghostly-looking Ted, and the others discussed the funeral arrangements as Bobby clung to life in intensive care. Ethel, who had already come to grips with the worst, decided that the services would be held at St. Patrick's Cathedral and the burial at Arlington National Cemetery next to Jack. Because there were so many people who would have to travel between the two cities by plane, the idea came up of using a train to carry them all from New York to Washington. The high drama of a funeral train was not even considered, only the logistics of transporting the many friends and family members. The decision was quickly telephoned to Hickory Hill, where a scene of controlled chaos existed. If all had gone according to plan, Bobby, Ethel, and the children would have been returning to Hickory Hill early in the evening of the 5th of our victory party. A crew of workmen had already spruced up the spacious lawns, cleaned the tennis courts, and decorated the swimming pool. Fresh slipcovers and spring patterns, flowers, cartons of food, and liquor had been delivered in preparation for the welcome home festivities. And now the house was surrounded by police and Secret Service men keeping back the press and hundreds of Washingtonians who had awakened to the horrible news and come to watch and to grieve. All of Ethel's girlfriends, Sarah Davis, Sue Markham, Kay Evans, and Buckwald, had arrived early in the morning to help. One of the first to get there was Gertrude Corbin, whose husband, Paul Corbin, was an advance man for Bobby. At the time of the shooting, he was with Ted at the campaign headquarters in San Francisco. I was in bed watching TV. It's about 1:30 in the morning, Gertrude Corbin recalled. I was shocked. I'd gone through it with Jack. I immediately called Lem Billings and told him what happened. I got dressed and rushed over to Hickory Hill at 5 a.m. Nobody was there except for the household help and a few others. It was very depressing for all of us. The only children at home were Bobby Jr., who had decided not to go to Los Angeles, and the baby, Douglas, just 14 months old. By mid-afternoon, the eldest of the children, Joe and Kathleen, arrived home from their boarding schools in New England. Despite the gloom that hung over the house, the Kennedy spirit seemed alive and well. At one point, the brothers, Joe and Bobby Jr., played touch football. Kathleen went out with friends and returned with cartons of ice cream. Surly Brummus, the dog, appeared to miss his master, wandering forlornly, stopping to sniff an abandoned football. Staff members and neighbors supplied the police and federal agents with cold drinks and sandwiches, which they stashed for later in the Toonerville trolley, a cart that in happier times the children used to ride around the grounds. Now law enforcement officers had wired it, equipped it with a sound speaker, and used it as part of a hastily rigged communication system. Earlier in the evening, John Glenn, Bob Gallen, and the 6 other Kennedy children landed at Dulles and were driven to the house. On TV, Frank Mankiewicz was about to give the next-to-last update on their father's condition. At the time, none of the children at Hickory Hill nor the reporter standing before Mankiewicz in Los Angeles were aware that funeral arrangements were already in the works. But the close friends at the house and McLean knew. Even though Bobby was still alive, Sarah Davis said later, Bobby's funeral was basically being planned. We knew that he was going to die. All the grown-ups in the house knew, taking phone calls from Los Angeles, making phone calls to New York, getting St. Patrick's and the whole deal. On television, Mankiewicz was saying, "The team of physicians attending Senator Robert Kennedy is concerned over his continuing failure to show improvement during the post-operative period. Senator Kennedy's condition is still described as extremely critical as to life. There will be no further regular bulletins until early tomorrow morning." That night, Bobby Jr., Joe, and Kathleen, accompanied by Lem Billings, Kay Evans, and a Secret Service agent, were flown to Los Angeles aboard the Jetstar, one of the planes in the presidential fleet. After refueling at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma, it arrived in Los Angeles around 11:30. Sometime after midnight on June 6, the family and the doctors met to discuss Bobby's condition. In attendance besides Ethel was Jean, Pat, Jackie, and Ted. Also present was Dr. Blake Watson, the obstetrician who was keeping a careful watch over Ethel. We were in intensive care while Bobby was on the table. Ethel was there beside him and I was behind her. The doctors were talking with the family about what to do because all along there had never been any sign of brain waves. They all talked for a while and they all agreed to pull the plug. Ethel was very staunch and very self-controlled. She was very, very, very calm about the whole thing. It was only a few minutes after they took the apparatus off Bobby that he didn't breathe anymore. Mankiewicz walked into the press room to announce that Bobby had died. He said the specific cause of death was the gunfire attack and the bullet that went into the head near the right ear. No mention was ever made, or would it be, that the family had decided to speed his death. Bobby's body was taken into the basement of the hospital for an autopsy. There, another angry confrontation would occur between a Kennedy aide and Detective Dan Stewart. Myself and another detective were the only 2 officers at the autopsy, Stewart said. Suddenly, this Kennedy aide walked in. I said, "Who are you?" He said that he had been asked to come down and watch over the autopsy for the family. Then he asked me who I was. And when I told him, he said, "You can't be in here. The family doesn't want you here looking at Bobby's nude body." I said, "Get the F out of here." Officially at 1:44 a.m. on Thursday, June 6, 1968, Ethel Skakel Kennedy, pregnant with her 11th child, became a widow. The one and only shining star in her life had been snuffed out. The end of that part. I don't have anything to add. It's a heavy chapter. It's really hard to hear about 10 children, one more on the way, losing their father, and who seems to be the parent who is most invested in them, even with his busy schedule. The next chapter that we're going to read, or the next part we're going to read, is entitled Widowhood, and I am so interested to get into that and see how Ethel is going to be dealing with this loss from her perspective, but then how is she going to deal with the loss with the needs of her kids pressing. So I think that the next couple of chapters are just going to be unbelievable. Thank you so much for reading with me today, and I will see you again soon. Bye.